You know, one of the hardest things about this business is that it is a business. Doesn't matter what we're selling, whether it's cars, nuclear weapons, or yes, even toys. The bottom line is the bottom line. And what are children, after all, but consumer trainees?
Bill Sims, you just won the Super Bowl. What are you doing next?
I'm gonna go to Disney World.
If our cultural memory in a post-literate society only goes back as far as the birth of moving pictures and mass communications, then who owns more of our media-saturated childhoods than this one mass media conglomerate? That's bad enough in itself, but let's also consider, just in terms of aesthetics and taste, what it means for Disney in particular to be the company which has that much power over children's culture and children. I've been referring a lot to the quote-unquote Disney version of various titles, but what are the chief characteristics of that? What is the Disney style? Well, as I mentioned, Walt wanted his cartoons to have a distinct cuteness factor from the very beginning. Excepting those occasions in the early films when a villain or an animated sequence was really meant to be frightening to kids, the default Disney designs for everyone and everything else, from kids to adults to animals to fantasy creatures, they always had some degree of cuteness, intended to appeal to small kids and their moms. And if you think I'm being reductive about Disney's target audience, by the way, I would cite this quote from Walt himself, attributed to a 1959 piece in The Hollywood Reporter. "Women are the best judges of anything we turn out. Their taste is very important. They are the theater goers. They are the ones who drag the men in. If the women like it, to heck with the men." I think it's safe to assume he wasn't talking about targeting childless women as Disney's most important demographic. I think he's talking about moms here, because Disney certainly wasn't targeting single men, and somebody's got to take the kids to the theater. Another key quote from Disney, in my opinion, is this one: "We allow no geniuses around our studio." It might be apocryphal because even though it's attributed to him in a lot of places, I can't find the actual source of it, but it does seem to refer to the reality that although Disney Animation obviously employed many talented artists and animators, they were always working in service of one man's vision. There were no auteur directors on Disney films.
Not a story goes into production without his approval. For Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Walt is spending most of his time in spirited meetings, where every detail of the action is discussed, acted out, and analyzed. When Walt finally okays the story, it goes along to the unit animation director.
It was all about the Disney style, the Disney name, the Disney brand. So visually speaking, this required a certain uniformity. Whatever the film was, whatever the differences in subject matter, any differences in visual style still needed to remain identifiable as the Disney style. Every now and again, both in Walt's time and in modern times, they do branch out a little, but never so far out that the end product is unrecognizable as Disney. Disney cuteness, both at its best and at its worst, always signals a kind of visual gentleness that instantly draws kids in. And the younger you are, the more attractive it is, because cartoons are exaggerations of reality, but Disney cartoons are exaggerations which stimulate your senses only in the simplest ways possible. They don't require much mental engagement. It puts you in a completely passive, almost narcotized state, like the animation equivalent of jangling keys in front of a baby. Within the Disney visual formula, there are sub-formulas. They have a whole catalog of established, reliable designs for how handsome heroes should look, how beautiful princesses should look, how sinister villains should look, old men, old women, dogs, cats, kids. Essentially, there is a short list of a few stock designs for every conceivable type of character, in Disney animation, which will always read, at a glance, as a Disney character. As far as the animation itself, how the characters move and react and express themselves, I think what you might call the broadness of Disney character animation must have been determined as part of the house style early on, so that whatever is happening on screen will always read as clearly as possible to the smallest of children in the audience. You rarely see the more subtle kind of animation acting that we might associate with Chuck Jones, for example. Subsequent generations of artists keep copying the company's past without thinking about why, except that that's just how it's done at Disney, and they're the best, right? So these components have been recycled now for decades and decades after Walt's been gone, only in a recursive, inbred, cargo cult fashion. All the characters and stories that get the Disney adaptation treatment, regardless of their origins, they get filtered through this same visual sameness. The consistent look of Disney is as much a part of their family-friendly brand as anything, because parents want to know what they're getting. Beyond the look of a Disney film, though, what defines the Disney brand when it comes to characters and stories? You'd think they would have an endless variety of them with all the source materials they've gathered from around the world over the years, but Disney tends to fit everything into prefabricated designs for stories as well as visuals. The original story of Beauty and the Beast, for example, doesn't really have a villain, and it certainly doesn't have a lot of cute little sidekick things or Broadway-style show tunes. So their adaptation more closely resembles their previous film, The Little Mermaid, than it does the fairy tale. These Hollywood formulas that everything gets plugged into, the heroes, the villains, the comedy relief characters, the three-act structure, it all has a way of flattening out the complexities and the unique qualities of the original works, which, to be fair, has always been a problem of Hollywood adaptations in general, but with Disney, they're simplifying for kids a lot of things that were already meant to be simple stories for kids. And the Hollywood treatment they add on top of that, celebrity voices, gratuitous songs, dialogue in modern vernacular, pop culture references, or even just the story beats that we expect when we see a movie, that takes material that was meant to be transcendent to kids, and it vulgarizes it. Because Disney claims so many powerful stories as their own, the core themes do retain some of their mystique even when they've gone through the Disneyfication process, but even adults who should know better will talk about the rich themes in Disney films as though it was the Walt Disney Company who came up with them. There's a long video of Jordan Peterson, for example, giving a lecture about the depth and complexity of Pinocchio. And Pinocchio does have a lot of depth and complexity, but he's completely conflating the original story with the Disney version, which also has a lot of prototypical Disney nonsense added to it. And while there's a lot to admire about the film as a work of animation, once again, the source material just becomes a footnote, an afterthought. Now, Pinocchio's an interesting case because it's actually one of the darkest Disney films in terms of how much strange and upsetting fairy tale content they decided to keep. It was made in 1940, and even at Disney, they assumed kids were made of tougher stuff than we give kids credit for today. I mentioned before how the oldest Disney films, to their credit, definitely have some content that's scarier than what the company allows now, and Pinocchio has some of the most infamous examples of that. In those early days, Disney definitely respected kids enough to sometimes show them more dramatically intense and frightening stuff. And it's not even the most big or obvious sequences like a kid turning into a donkey or Monstro the giant whale. There's lots of little rough edges in those old stories they were adapting at the very beginning that would all get smoothed out today. Like how in Snow White, the Wicked Queen doesn't just tell her huntsman to kill Snow White. Gruesomely, she wants him to bring Snow White's heart back to her in a box. But still, Disney being Disney, in the same film you also have the comedy stylings of Dopey the Dwarf. And in Pinocchio, their next film, which has some of Disney's scariest stuff ever, you see more additions of these cutesy details, or toning down the violence in places. For example, Jiminy Cricket is Pinocchio's cute little sidekick throughout the Disney version. In the 1883 fantasy novel on which the film is based, Pinocchio kills him with a hammer. Sounds like a joke, but it's true. Snow White was also full of cute little animals everywhere, and really, for almost 100 years now, Disney has never missed the opportunity to squeeze a few cute little animals into any story. Like even their version of Pocahontas has to give her a cute little raccoon and a hummingbird. I think one of the motivations behind this is to provide a constant reassurance to children watching that no matter how scary or upsetting things get, they're still in safe hands, and everything is ultimately going to be fine, even though they rarely attempt anything anymore as upsetting as in those early films. Maybe the most infamous example is the off-screen shooting of Bambi's mom, and that's certainly a film with cute animals to spare. But even by the end of the 1940s, you could tell they were backing off, trying not to upset those moms too much. Overall, compared to some of their wilder contemporaries in the golden age of Hollywood animation, Disney stuff is highly technically accomplished, but just very conservative and reserved in terms of content. You always get the sense you're watching something that's very conscious of not wanting to upset anyone. Consider their version of Jack and the Beanstalk in 1947, starring Mickey, Donald, and Goofy. What is the most famous line in that fairy tale? Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread. The giant in Mickey and the Beanstalk makes no such threats. He's just kind of an oaf. Another example, a few years later, Disney's 1953 version of Peter Pan. The original story ends with Captain Hook getting eaten by the crocodile. That shouldn't be too upsetting to little kids, right? Captain Hook is the villain. But just to make it a little nicer, a little less violent, the Disney film ends with him and Smee merely being chased away. It's more lighthearted, more silly. And maybe in of itself, that's not such a big deal, but with every adaptation of theirs, they always make changes like those to soften things up. And when you add up all those changes in the ever-growing Disney catalog, this parallel canon of children's culture, it stands in pretty stark contrast to the source materials in terms of how sanitized it is. Not to say that Disney doesn't still sometimes take the cheap shot of traumatizing kids, usually with the deaths of characters' parents, for instant pathos. But they've figured out subtler ways to do that now that are more gentle than the sound of a gunshot going off. Consider, too, that traumatic experiences, real or simulated, can create just as much of a bond for children as any happy memories. Alternating between stimulating pleasure and inflicting trauma, that's one of the oldest, surest methods of mental manipulation and control. I want to briefly mention the prominence of songs in Disney films because music is just as much of a uniquely human and transcendent activity as storytelling. A good song can get stuck in your head like no other work of art. Music is also one of the ancient cornerstones of culture, and as such, it's always going to play a huge part in people's childhoods. No surprise, then, that the many songs of Disney films have become a part of so many people's childhood memories as well. Disney's music catalog is definitely a cornerstone of their brand, insofar as helping make Disney a multimedia empire. Because in a similar way to how their catalog of Disney-fied classics pushed out the original stories over time, the Disney music catalog has also pushed out a lot of the Great American Folk Music Songbook as a shared common musical culture, where parents might once have bought a record of kids' songs like This Old Man, or I Knew an Old Lady Who Swallowed a Fly, or She'll Be Comin' Round the Mountain, etc. They're now much more likely to put on a Disney playlist on Spotify when they want something for the kids to listen to. When you become a parent and you find yourself back in public spaces intended for children, you start noticing how pervasive Disney music is. They put it on everywhere, not just in indoor playgrounds and ice skating rinks and places like that, but even at my daughter's ballet classes, they're having the girls practice to Let It Go in A Whole New World. It's not like Disney has to sponsor any of this free advertising. It's just parentally pre-approved, and everyone assumes kids already know it and like it. a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that's not even getting into all the pop music for preteens and adolescents published by the Disney Music Group, which was founded in 1998. As far as how Disney songs function in actual Disney movies, I think it's similar to the animal sidekicks. It makes every story a little bit gentler. Take The Lion King, which has a classic Disney death of the parent traumatic loss scene. It's only a few minutes after this scene that the two wacky comedy relief sidekicks are introduced, and it's only a few minutes after that they're singing Hakuna Matata. I'm sure any Disney fan who's still watching this is probably thinking, hey, what about that song in The Hunchback of Notre Dame about hellfire? That's pretty serious. Well, for one thing, that was an aberration even at the time, and they definitely wouldn't do that today. But more to the point, they still put a song about burning in hell into an adaptation of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which gives Quasimodo goofy talking gargoyle sidekicks. Hunchback is really the peak of Disneyfication being applied where it doesn't belong, but the tonal dissonance between those two things isn't accidental, it's deliberate. Even when Disney is adapting Victor Hugo, it can never get too serious for too long. That's the Disney way. I know I don't need to go on about all of these visual and conceptual cliches, because we've all grown up on Disney, and once we start thinking about the commonalities between Disney movies, we can name a lot of them. New formulas do get introduced at Disney every few decades, but most of them were present from the start, back in Walt's day. And these patterns are so consistent, it's not even hard to imagine a Disney movie that could be completely generated by AI with just a little prompting. To briefly acknowledge the post-Pixar era of Disney that we're currently in, Pixar did introduce some new visual ideas and stories to the company, but they've since had their own problems with being artistically formulaic, not to mention morally reductive. The point is, we take these consistent features of Disney for granted, just as we take the Disneyfication of culture for granted, just as we take the predominance of Disney in children's lives for granted. The company has a uniform vision for what all culture should be, according to their brand. Once any idea, new or old, has been assimilated into the Disney corporate cosmology. A side effect, by the way, of Disney being considered the industry leader of animation since forever is there are many imitators of Disney cuteness and imitators of their simplified characters and stories, which has made it very difficult for American audiences to see animation as anything more than entertainment for small children. When we see Disney-style animation or cartoon art, we're trained to think, yes, that's what professional, legitimate American cartooning at its best looks and sounds and feels like. And that was always their goal, not just success, but primacy. The foundations of what we know as the Disney style began with Walt Disney himself, obviously. But in the same sense that Walt never intended for his versions of the classics to replace the originals, I also don't think the changes he made to them were done out of any cynical calculation to water down the source material for mass appeal. I think the changes he made, the changes that constitute the basis of what we think of as Disney movies, really did just reflect his own personal tastes. What he thought was funny and what he thought were the best parts of the stories and whatever he thought would make them better. He was kind of a corny guy, even by 1930s standards. And it's still his corny interpretation of culture, from European fairy tales to Americana to classic or contemporary literature, that's the foundation of the Disney style and ethos. Again, nothing wrong with that in of itself, but the Walt Disney Company is practically the Ministry of Culture for America now, and children's culture is a lot cornier for it. The cumulative effect of all of these aesthetic choices, which Disney makes in a procedural way, they basically reduce all of children's culture into mere entertainment. And what I mean by that is, when they take all this folklore and myths and legends and refine them down into something a typical family might go see at the mall, it removes almost all sense of enchantment, of suspending your disbelief and feeling like you're being taken to another world. Adapting stuff to fit within the confines of a Hollywood movie tends to turn everything into just another movie. Susceptible as kids are to the immersion of movies, even kids learn pretty quickly what to expect from most of them, and for kids that makes any story a little less special. There's a definite comfort and reassurance in that consistency for kids, but there also isn't as much magic or discovery to be had. They can categorize what they've seen as just another Disney movie, and in their imaginations, what they've seen is never going to be any bigger than that. The world of Disney is an insular, parochial one, and its familiarity provides pacification rather than inspiration. To pay respect where it's due once more, I do think the early Disney films achieve a certain level of enchantment just from the sheer level of technical accomplishment on display. Because not only were they products of a time when it was assumed that kids could handle stronger stuff, they were also products of Walt's drive to prove that big-budget, feature-length animation was a justified concept. He wanted his animators to dazzle people, and they did. From Snow White in 1937 to Sleeping Beauty in 1959, you just see an objectively higher level of artistic skill on display than what came after, which is largely routine and self-imitation. Further diminishing any sense of enchantment in these stories was that, starting with Disney's Aladdin in 1992, the studio really began allowing a greater degree of modern, ironic self-awareness in these stories. That was just the tone of the times, I guess, but for any kid who wants to experience a fantasy, Hipness and enchantment don't mix. This might seem like a stretch, but there's a direct line from the more tongue-in-cheek humor of Aladdin to the outright fairy tale parody of the Shrek movies. And I suppose you can imagine how I feel about those. Not to mention all those parents who don't read fairy tales to their kids, but will put on Shrek movies for them at 3 years old. Up until Aladdin, Disney movies basically respected the integrity of the worlds they were trying to create. But there's a definite shift in tone towards Post-Modernism when you have the characters using more anachronistic references and fourth-wall breaking humor as that film did. It might be entertaining, but does it capture the imagination? Imagine you were a kid in 1939 who'd just seen The Thief of Baghdad, which is a very lavish and fantastical adaptation of the Arabian Nights stories. Once that movie left the local theater, if you were still fascinated by what you'd seen, you probably would have sought out the book at your library to see what else that world had to offer. Were there a lot of kids inspired to read the Arabian Nights after seeing the jokey, smarmy version of them in Aladdin? Whether the Disney version of a classic is hip or merely cute, it kind of sucks the special qualities of it right out, or redirects them to other places. I'm willing to bet that Aladdin inspired a lot more kids to get into musical theater than to open a book. And how many kids who saw Disney's Robin Hood were inspired to read that, compared to the number of kids who saw it and just became furries? To speak a bit now about the place Disney had in my own childhood, as an older millennial, I'd like to propose a generational theory. It goes like this. Just as baby boomers were the first generation to have Disney be a constant feature of childhood, literally within their own homes because of television, I think that millennials like myself were the first generation to really experience Disney in our childhoods as a mass media, vertically integrated marketing operation. One that made Disney not just a brand of children's entertainment, but basically a lifestyle brand. There was a whole other level of media saturation happening which didn't exist in my parents' time. In the 70s and 80s, when Gen Xers were kids, that was kind of the wilderness period for Disney. That was where they were floundering before they became the modern media juggernaut they are today. Initially, that started to happen because there was a renewed interest in American animation at the time, and starting with Roger Rabbit in 1988 and The Little Mermaid in 1989, suddenly people were excited about new animated Disney movies again. It was during this period that they also launched a new syndicated block of TV programming called The Disney Afternoon, reaching millions of kids after school. But I think what really started to push them over the top and let them dominate kids' lives at this time It wasn't just the popularity of their new films, even though those were very popular. It was that simultaneously, the majority of their old movie catalog was coming out on home video for the first time. All the famous titles from their parallel canon of classics like Cinderella, Peter Pan, Robin Hood, etc., were coming out concurrently to the theatrical and home video releases of the new stuff like The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast. So you just had this insane level of cross-promotion happening between the company's past and present and future. There was nothing so common in every family's home at the time as those big Disney VHS clamshell cases by the VCR. Suddenly, kids could watch these movies over and over again. And it didn't stop at the home because the wider availability of Disney videos meant that they were also being played for millions of kids in daycare centers every day, or even in schools when our educators didn't feel like teaching that day. Speaking again of Disney brand kids music, when I was around 8 or 9 years old, I think my elementary school music teacher had us spend at least a year singing songs from Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin. That's cultural education for you in America. Again, it's not like Disney had to sponsor any of this, it just happened because they had over 50 years worth of brand recognition to kids, and trust with parents, and this giant back catalog of product. Suddenly, it was all paying off bigger dividends than ever as every boomer parent filled their kids' lives with Disney to an unprecedented degree. Disney really didn't miss a trick during this period because while all this was happening, they started leaning into marketing the Disney brand as more than just a studio that makes quality family entertainment and runs a couple of theme parks. They were now self-consciously declaring themselves an American institution. Their catalog wasn't just a bunch of kids' movies, it was part of the country's cultural inheritance. And you had no choice but to stand in reverence to the incredible monument that was, is, and always will be Disney.
They're timeless gifts of imagination, inspired by Walt Disney's extraordinary vision. Classic stories that are part of our heritage. Stories every child should have. Family keepsakes for every generation, and a collection that continues to grow. With more great movies to add to your collection. Look for the Walt Disney Masterpiece Collection, wherever videos are sold.
The company cultivated an almost cult-like worship drilled into kids' and parents' heads whenever they watched a Disney video, because those videos always opened with a litany of ads about the latest re-releases of old titles and the latest release that you should be eagerly anticipating. Not to mention how you should be planning your vacation to Disneyland, which is presented as nothing less than a religious pilgrimage. And they openly did what Walt claimed he never wanted to do. They conflated all these old and new Disney versions with the classics they were based on in a way that disregarded the originals. This was reinforced by the fact that as all these old characters and stories were being recirculated, of course, they were also being merchandised on a level that they never had before. This is also around the time when you started seeing all these various characters with disparate origins being grouped together as part of just one big corporate ensemble, especially the growing roster of so-called Disney princesses, none of whom actually originated at Disney. The whole Disney princess marketing concept has been a huge part of virtually every little girl's life in America for over 3 decades now, and it's too big a subject to completely pick apart, but as far as robbing little girls of their imaginations, here's one microcosm of that. When I was a kid, around Halloween, you would see girls dressed up in original homemade princess costumes. Those are pretty much gone now, and we know what company to blame. There's an aspect of status seeking being taught to little girls here as well, because if the Disney Cinderella, for example, is the Cinderella which every little girl knows, and she's being glamorously displayed on clothing and other merchandise, then that's the real Cinderella as far as any little girl is concerned. And any parents, especially those who are already status conscious and have already taught their kids to feel anxiety about social status, they've already learned to associate the Disney brand with higher value. So their daughters are not going to be satisfied with some Cinderella Halloween costume that's not the Disney Cinderella, or a non-Disney Cinderella doll, or a non-Disney Cinderella film, or anything else, even though it's all based on the same public domain character. Not if they know the Disney one as the real one, which is how Disney likes it. Their parents probably think of Cinderella that way too, because when Disney puts their trademark on a character or story, it becomes a childhood luxury item. Now, in fairness to the Walt Disney Company, it's not as though they're uniquely guilty in targeting kids' minds so that their parents will buy them a lot of branded merchandise. That's just a feature of modern mass media in general, and I mean modern like going back to the 1930s, when kids would listen to The Lone Ranger or Dick Tracy on the radio and then beg mom to buy some junk they'd seen in the toy store with their heroes on it. The more mass media for kids there is, the fewer kids there are playing cowboys and Indians or soldiers or pirates. Today they're playing Paw Patrol or Spider-Man because that's what they're watching. It's their common frame of reference. When I was a young boy, I was pretty obsessed with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles for a while, and that's as good an example as any of a huge multimedia merchandising campaign which captured my young imagination. My point is that in the 90s, Disney became experts at those kinds of psychological operations directed at kids. That was the point at which they embedded themselves so deeply into American culture that every adult institution started providing Disney media and merchandise to kids voluntarily. When your kid goes to the dentist's office, there's Disney characters on the walls. When your little girl finishes her doctor's appointment, she gets a lollipop and a Disney princess sticker. Because of this, kids don't just grow up associating Disney with feelings of happiness, but also trust and authority. Aside from TV shows, home videos, and omnipresent merchandise, the primary way Disney made themselves a permanent part of the childhood status quo was the almost totalitarian way in which every new Disney movie was released. In the 90s, it was treated like a nationwide coronation event. The Lion King wasn't just a new movie, it was also a new video game, and a McDonald's Happy Meal, and a soundtrack album with a hit single. It had a mountain of ancillary licensed products like dolls and clothes and bed sheets and anything you can think of for kids. And then, after almost a whole year of hype, the whole operation just moves on to whatever the next movie is coming out. Meanwhile, you were also seeing spin-off TV shows and direct-to-video sequels for various Disney movies, old and new. Keep in mind, too, that this was back when the internet was in its infancy, so TV and movies didn't really have any competition for kids' attention. Also, consider how a child's perception of time is extremely slow. When you're a kid, days can seem like weeks and months can seem like years. 90s kids pretty much felt like Disney was part of the air they were breathing at all times because of these continual, multifaceted advertising and marketing blitzes. Past a certain point, after the 90s, the company wasn't able to just gin up that kind of excitement, to manufacture that kind of hysteria out of thin air anymore, but for a while there, Disney had the cultural capital and the reach to make the Disney brand as inseparable from every American's childhood as any studio ever had, let alone any multimedia empire like theirs. In a way, they commodified that magical feeling of childhood itself, selling their brand as a way for parents to just buy those special feelings for their kids at a store. The ubiquity of their images in a child's life was the point in of itself. Familiarity is important to kids. It's comforting. They like seeing the Disney characters everywhere because in knowing those characters and recognizing them, they feel like they know them as friends. It's because of this familiarity that, in the big picture, none of these cultural products which bear these images exist independently. A bottle of shampoo with Ariel's head on it is not merely meant to evoke memories of the film The Little Mermaid. A Mickey Mouse t-shirt does not simply represent a picture of the character Mickey Mouse. Every Disney product is essentially an advertisement for Disney itself, a trillion little idols. And every piece of Disney media and merchandise, past or present, are part of a greater whole, the Disney ecosystem, the most sophisticated and largest-scale multi-generational marketing campaign that's ever existed.
One vast and ecumenical holding company, for whom all men will work to serve a common profit.
For reality, it's not